Can I welcome you on behalf of the Maths Anxiety Trust to this meeting tonight. It's really a delight to have you all here, and thank you for coming out on a very dark and cold night, but it's really good to meet people again. I wanted to say before we begin just one or two things about the Maths Anxiety Trust. It's a very small operation, but it is actually run by a very powerful person, and that's not me. It was founded about just over 5 years ago by someone who is well known as a writer, a journalist, a designer, and a wonderful campaigner. And she has just passed her 90th birthday, and she is still working as hard as ever. And so I wanted to make sure that you, if you care to join me in thanking Shirley for everything she's done with her time and her money towards raising the profile of maths anxiety. So if we'd... Shirley realised that this was an important problem for adults and for students, and therefore we all needed to be much more aware of it. And in that time, I think we all have become so, and it's very much thanks to Shirley. We started, I think, particularly with the students, with the teenagers, and the first research that was done was with them in mind, but we became aware after our first summit, which is back in 2018, which was very much about maths anxiety for teenagers, that actually it affected more people, not only adults, but actually also teachers. So the last meeting we had, which was online, was in 2021, and it was realising that for some teachers, maths anxiety was a problem as well. We thought we needed a little bit more knowledge about this because it's not written up in the literature. So we have now done a poll of teachers, and I'm going to explain that to you in a minute. But it brought up the whole business about teacher training in maths. And so that's the reason for tonight's topic, maths anxiety in teachers. Are we giving our teachers adequate training in the teaching of maths? In this, we felt it was very important to be a partner with the other institutions that were involved in this field. So we're very grateful for the Chartered College of Teaching, that Alison will be speaking in a minute, National Numeracy, that we have Sam speaking from there, the Mathematical Association, Colin, Learnus, the Learning Skills Foundation, which is represented by Caroline, who's organised the whole business today. And we've also got a speaker, Sue, from the British Society for Research and Learning Maths. So we're hoping to sort of cover a number of those background things, background aspects today from different areas. I think I'll just start really by giving some of the details of this poll that we have done. First of all, it was done by YouGov, and those are the speakers, and afterwards there will be a panel discussion, so please do keep all your questions and comments or anything else you want to say, because there will be time to do that later. This survey was completed online in June. The questions were a joint effort between the Maths Anxiety Trust and the College of the Chartered College of Teaching. And the sample, they have a kind of a representative-based sample online of 800,000, and we asked them to select from those everybody who is currently teaching mathematics, either in primary or in secondary, or as a teaching assistant. And you'll see the numbers that we got, 608 primary, 569 secondary, and 283 teaching assistants. We can break down the data, I've got some further analysis of that, by various factors that they keep, but we can't usually calibrate, as it were. So I can't always go right down to the small cells, but however, we explained to all the teachers taking part, this was an online survey, that by maths anxiety we had the usual definition: a negative emotional reaction to mathematics leading to various degrees of helplessness, panic and mental disorganisation when faced with a maths problem. And we then asked teachers to say whether they sometimes, often, always, never, etc., experience maths anxiety in lessons. These are cumulative, so the sometimes people include the often and the always. So out of that, 24% of our primary teachers said that they sometimes experience maths anxiety in lessons, 20% of our secondary and 32% of our teaching assistants. Often was a bit smaller, much smaller, 5%, 7%, 7%, and only a few always, thankfully. We asked how confident they felt both in their maths knowledge and understanding and in their ability to explain maths. And those who said they were not feeling very confident in their maths knowledge were not many primaries, 9%, slightly more secondaries, 14%, perhaps as you might expect, rather more teaching assistants, 23%. But what was a bit strange, I think, I was not expecting, that when we asked them how confident they felt about their ability to explain maths, 38% of secondary teachers said they weren't confident about their ability to explain maths. Only 9% of primary, 29% of teaching assistants. And of the secondary, 12% said that they felt not at all confident in their ability to explain maths. So this seemed to be a slightly worrying, rather something that we hadn't really expected. We asked if they felt they'd been sufficiently trained to teach maths, and this again was a bit of a surprise. 17% disagreed that they'd been sufficiently trained, in other words, felt that they hadn't been sufficiently trained to teach maths. 44% of the secondary teachers felt they hadn't been sufficiently trained, of whom 23% out of that 44 strongly disagreed with that statement, and teaching assistants 32%. So that's really why we moved on to this as the topic for tonight's session, because it seems to be really quite important that we have almost half our teachers feeling that they're not properly trained to do their job. When you break it down by the training, we asked how they'd been trained. I'm afraid it's not possible. This is where we can't cross-calibrate. We can't say how many of the secondary people did PGCEs, but I can tell you that of the people who've done PGCEs, about a third were primary and 2/3 were secondary. But I can't actually break down this particular thing in that proportion. But BEds were reasonably rather more satisfied. 17% felt they hadn't been sufficiently trained. PGC was much higher at 34%. Teaching assistant qualifications similarly, and others. There were all sorts of other qualifications, of course, out there as well. So it did look as though the length of training was quite important. Many of the others were shorter training even than a year. And we finally asked whether teachers felt that the external pressures impacted their ability to teach maths effectively. And again, I think we were quite surprised that 54% of our primary teachers felt that external pressures were stopping them teaching maths effectively. This seems like a worrying proportion, that something is stopping them doing their job as well as they think they can do it. It was rather lower in secondary, rather higher in teaching assistants. And of those, 18% of the primary teachers felt, really they strongly agreed that the external pressures were getting in the way. So that is the rough summary of our results of the poll. I mean, there are further details and we can break it down more, but that's the background to today's session, and I'm going to ask, first of all, Alison, Dame Professor, I must get this right, Professor Dame Alison Peacock, and Alison is, I'm going to read this out to make sure I get it right, is the Chief Executive of the Chartered College of Teaching, Prior to becoming chief executive, she was executive head teacher of the Wroxham School in Hertfordshire, and she was, I think, one of the first head teachers to become a dame. So it was a really, this school had a tremendous reputation. She's also taught in primary, secondary and advisory roles, is an honorary fellow of Queen's College, Cambridge, and is a visiting professor of the Universities of Hertfordshire and Glendower. She's a public speaker, writer, and best-known originator of Learning Without Limits approach to education. She's also a trustee of Teach First and a columnist for the TES. So thank you, Alison.
Well, thank you, Margaret. Gosh, it's always embarrassing when people read out your qualifications, isn't it? I'm just going to get my clock so that I make sure that I don't overrun. So, thank you very much for asking me to speak about this important subject. Obviously, leading the Chartered College of Teaching, we're really, our whole raison d'etre at the Chartered College is to enable teachers to build their expertise. And what we've just seen, the results of that survey, I think are very worrying indeed. This is not to blame teachers. What I'm going to talk about is how we can create a climate whereby it's okay for teachers to ask for help. It's okay to be able to look for support from your colleagues. Now, research on maths anxiety has a long history, and the concept of number anxiety was first introduced in 1957. And it was defined by Draeger and Allen as fear, tension, and discomfort, which are felt by some individuals in situations involving mathematics, which may interfere with the performance of mathematical tasks. Now, when you look at the results from that YouGov survey, almost a quarter of our primary teachers suffer anxiety about mathematics, and this will inevitably communicate itself to the children that they teach. And with a similar, well, we're actually with half the number of teachers, half our teachers that filled in that survey said that they feared the effectiveness of their maths teaching was compromised negatively by external pressures. So these are worrying statistics. Now, I want to draw on the stories of some children that I've taught and that I've worked with over the years, thinking about the approach that they have to mathematics is important to us, because on the principle that children, well, we're all just grown-up children, aren't we? So if children experience anxiety or difficulty or frustration in their mathematics experience at school, that will translate into their understanding and their approach to the subject when they become adults. And some of those children will become teachers. So I think the issues start at school, and we can't avoid the fact they start in school. They're formative experiences. So I want to start by talking to you about Archie. Now, I first met Archie when he was 3 years old. He was an only child. His mum and dad loved him to bits. Can I move this down a bit so you can see you? Look, there we are. They loved him to bits, and they very proudly brought him into school to look around the school, and they said to me, actually, Archie is a genius. He's a mathematical genius. I said, oh, that's fantastic. Well, actually, Archie was a lovely little boy, and he was fascinated with all things to do with number, with pattern, with shape. He just loved everything to do with mathematics. Imagine what that would have been like for Archie if, when he came into our nursery or when he met the reception staff, if he had been told, well, I'm sorry, we only count to 20 here. We don't go above 20 in the reception class. How awful would have that been for him? Because he was so excited. And he was encouraged to use manipulatives. He was encouraged to really engage with mathematics in all its fullness throughout school, because the teachers he encountered weren't frightened of maths. They weren't frightened of finding out. They weren't frightened of the fact that he was going to be exploring aspects of mathematics that the rest of the children perhaps weren't going to be. It's really important for Archie and his self-belief and his self-efficacy as a young mathematician that he encountered teachers who were equally passionate in maths. What would have happened if he'd have been with those teachers who were anxious themselves? I suspect that rather than seeing him as enthusiastic and endearing, they may well have found him to be quite a pain in the backside, because he would have already sorted out the answers before they'd even put them up on the board. And then we come to Nancy. Now, Nancy arrived at our school at the beginning of year 3. She'd been excluded from the previous school. She'd moved from a school beyond that. So Mum was very, very angry. She didn't expect that Nancy was going to be successful in our school. And the first day that she came in, when it was the maths lesson, she went under the table and refused to come out. Because her experience of maths was that she just got it all wrong, and it was something that you could mark with ticks and crosses, and she wasn't going to engage with it because she didn't want to be found out as being somebody who couldn't do maths. Interestingly, in Nancy's case, as I said to you, Mum was really angry, and I met with her in my office, and I tried to reassure her and say that it was going to be all right, and that we were going to work with her daughter, and we were going to believe in her, and actually we would love her and we would support her through school. Mum wasn't going to have that. She was like, you're not going to do this. She was really, really cross. Actually, what happened with Nancy was that her teacher, not only was her teacher a very confident mathematician, she was an AST in the days that we could have advanced skills teachers, now replaced with chartered teachers, and we have one in the room. So her teacher, who was a good mathematician, but she was also a musician. And she realised that Nancy loved to sing. And so the way through for Nancy was through singing lessons, which meant that she became more confident, which meant that she would engage with the maths. And by the time she got to year 6, she was one of those children that if you came to visit the school and Nancy was chosen or volunteered to be the guide, she was the one that I would want, because she knew what it was like to be in a school where you weren't valued, where you weren't listened to, where you weren't given the opportunity to flourish. And then we had Louisa, who arrived at our school in year 5, and she was a child who had been very badly bullied in her previous school. So she was already exhibiting all kinds of anxiety herself. She was actually a very capable mathematician. She was used to being in the top set. And so when she arrived at our school and we said, well, we don't have sets here. We work in a way across mathematics, which is about challenging yourself, about giving you choice so that you can show how much you can do and how much more against personal best, i.e. no limits. She was very cross about this because she liked the idea of being in the top set. It was very comfortable being in the gold group or whichever group it was. She didn't like the idea that she was going to have to prove herself because that was quite threatening. She was a child who didn't look up, so she spent most of her time sort of staring at the floor, answered in sort of monosyllabic responses and so on. By the time she reached year 6, at our summer concert at the end of the year, we had a summer concert. She played her violin. Her mother accompanied her on the piano, and she just blew all of us away with her talent. She sort of stood there. She looked out at the audience. She smiled. She was full of confidence. So she'd avoided becoming one of those students that was subject to exam stress, test stress related to mathematics. So all of this in a school where we were trying really hard not to label children, not to limit children, not to label teachers, really fundamentally, not to label teaching assistants. So one of our staff who joined the school when I was there, she came to us from the advertising industry. She had had her career in advertising and she wanted to train to teach. And I remember talking to her and encouraging her to apply. So she studied with the university and then she came and she worked with us and then she was employed by us at the school. When she was a student herself at school, she had found mathematics really scary. She'd found it really difficult. But she had to overcome that because she wanted to become a primary teacher. And subsequently, she engaged in a maths mastery course. She became one of the best maths teachers we had in our school. I doubt she would have done that if she'd come across an environment which was all about judgment, where there was a kind of sense that you either pass, fail, you're either good enough or you're not. So the culture that we create within our schools either exacerbates maths anxiety amongst students and staff, or it alleviates it and enables people to try again, if you like, and have the opportunity to learn within a supportive environment and to teach to strengths. So within the environment that we were working within Wroxham, we were studying the environment, we were working with the University of Cambridge, and we identified a series of dispositions that we were working towards. I want to share these with you, but I want to share these with you within the frame of me moving to the Chartered College of Teaching. So I'd got all of this experience, I was working in a school, we developed these dispositions towards a kind of an open approach to teaching and learning. And then from the school, I went to start the Chartered College of Teaching, because my belief is that if we could work in this way with as many teachers as possible, the world would be a better place. So this first disposition is one of questioning. Having a questioning kind of environment, one of restlessness and humility, as opposed to a reliance on false certainties and ready-made solutions. An inventive environment, a culture where creativity and creative responses to challenges are really at the heart, as opposed to compliance with imposed models and materials. A persistent environment where courage and humility are at the heart, so never giving up, trying to find a way through, as opposed to settling for easy answers, rejecting complexity. An environment where emotional stability is really important and it's understood, so that people can take risks, as opposed to fearing failure, a fear of trying, a fear of not wanting to engage with new things in case you're found out for not being good enough. A generous environment that welcomes difference. We are not all the same. Thank goodness we're not all the same. But we should be celebrating the fact that we are a diverse group of colleagues working together, a diverse group of children, as opposed to deficit thinking, as opposed to a desire for uniformity. An environment with empathy, mutual supportiveness, as opposed to one where fear, defensiveness, and blame and ranking are the norm. And then finally, and I think actually most importantly, an environment across school of openness, of the ideas and possibilities that can go, the art of the possible, allowing children to surprise us. This is really crucial. But it's also about allowing adults to surprise us as well. I believe learning is lifelong, and we should never be just shutting the door and saying, that's it, you can't do this, you're no good. So openness as opposed to a belief that there's one right way and that all outcomes are predictable. So starting the Chartered College of Teaching, I wanted to create an environment where all of these things would be celebrated. And we continue to work to enable the conversation to carry on. I've actually cornered a couple of colleagues today, I'm constantly working. So even while I was enjoying my canapés, beautiful canapés, and a glass of wine, I've cornered a couple of colleagues to write a blog about this evening, about maths anxiety, that we can publish at the Chartered College of Teaching so that we can keep the conversation going. And just to finish, I just want to share with you a letter that Nancy's mum wrote to me at the end of year 6. Nancy, you remember Nancy's mum was pretty cross. She wrote to me, she said, "Dear Mrs. Peacock, I am writing this letter to personally thank you for the interest you took in Nancy during her stay at Wroxham. You promised me when Nancy joined the school that your team and yourself would work with her to bring out the best in her. And this is what Wroxham is about. You kept your word. But this is exactly what you helped achieve with Nancy. Words cannot express how much we truly appreciate your effort. But may God bless you and all your teachers. And we pray that you continue to give children's lives meaning. Best wishes, Nancy's mum." So I think that's what it's all about. It's about how we work together, we don't blame people, we recognise where, in fact, we can teach to strengths, and we keep on learning. So thank you very much indeed for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this evening. Thank you.
So, good evening. Hello, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you all this evening. And a big thank you, firstly, to the Maths Anxiety Trust for organising this event and for yet again continuing to shine a light on this really, really important issue. I'm going to share with you a few reflections on how we might better train and support teachers in light of the data that we've already seen tonight, But firstly, I'm also going to share a few of the things that I think might go at least some way to explaining some of that data. I want to start by challenging some of the assumptions and providing some context about the levels of competence and confidence in understanding and working with numbers and maths as a nation, really, as a nation as a whole. So I'm just going to share some of this for a moment. So, as you will all, many of you will know, the Gateway GCSE maths pass rate remains relatively high at 73% this year. Yet adult numeracy levels paint a very different picture. Half of all adults have the numeracy level expected of a primary school child, and 78% are working below a level 2. Now, the underlying data here is quite old. It's really from 2011, from Skills for Life and from OECD Peacock data. But at National Numeracy, we've undertaken further research, both in 2019 and earlier this year. And this continues to support this stubborn statistic, which remains true even when we look at younger adults who aren't that far out from the education system. It's still absolutely true. So how can these two seemingly contradictory statistics both be true? Well, part of this, I believe, is that the maths that we learn in school, the system of assessing our competence in maths, and yes, sometimes the unintended consequences of how it is taught, doesn't always prepare us and equip us well for the maths that we need in everyday life and many jobs, even if we do have a pass at GCSE maths. And in many cases, it doesn't provide us with the confidence and the belief that if we persist, we can improve. But why is this relevant to today's question? Well, in practice, what this often means is that hundreds of thousands of people who pass their Gateway GCSE maths qualification also emerge for very understandable reasons with low confidence in maths or maths anxiety. Some of these people will choose to go and work in schools and go on to become brilliant teachers and teaching assistants, while, as the data we've seen shows, often experiencing and overcoming maths anxiety or low confidence with maths. But what does this data tell us about adequate training? Well, I want to dig a bit further into some data that we have at National Numeracy around the self-reported confidence levels, skills levels, and feelings towards maths of nearly 11,000 trainee teachers who've been required to take the National Numeracy Challenge, which is an adaptive online learning tool that helps adults build confidence as well as skills with maths. So our data paints a very similar picture to the data we've seen already. 27% of trainee teachers report having low confidence with maths at the outset. But there is a more nuanced picture underneath. As this diagram shows, 69% of trainees have skills that do broadly match their confidence. 16% are overconfident. They have high confidence and low skills. And 14%, interestingly, are underconfident. They have low confidence and high skills. 43% of those 11,000 have either low skills, low confidence, or both low skills and low confidence. I think this shows that we need to provide support in a more nuanced way, focusing on helping teachers build their confidence in some cases, and their knowledge, understanding, and skills, of course, in others. We also, at National Numeracy, ask teachers at the outset to choose a word from a selection of positive and negative words that best describes how they feel about maths. 31% of those trainee teachers chose a negative word, either nervous, anxious, worried, confused, panic, stupid, defeated, terrified, or sick. And while we do indeed see a correlation between feeling negative about maths and both skill level and confidence level, there are 25% of people who say they feel negatively but actually have both high skills and high confidence when it comes to maths. They have good numeracy. Underneath those two observations that I've just shared sits an even more nuanced picture. For example, when we look at the nearly 9% of trainee teachers who say that maths makes them feel anxious, we've seen from the previous slide that on average they're more likely to have lower confidence and skills with maths. However, when we look closer, as shown in the table on the right as you look at the screen, there are unsurprisingly lots of notable exceptions. Lots of people sitting across the entire spectrum of skills and confidence levels. So I want to get back to training and supporting teachers. I think we must more closely consider all three of these elements that I've talked about: confidence, skills, and how we feel about maths. Training should support teachers to be curious and self-reflective about where they sit in each of these dimensions without fear of stigma. More specifically, where teachers have maths anxiety, they should be equipped with strategies to help build their confidence, their understanding, and also help to drive their enthusiasm. Being more confident with maths themselves will help teachers be more adaptable, for example, in finding different ways of teaching the same concept, and to address children's misconceptions about the value of maths and their own belief about whether or not they can improve. We should ensure that teachers have a good awareness of maths anxiety amongst children, how to recognise it, and strategies for supporting maths anxious pupils. We must also ensure that teachers understand the importance of talking positively about maths and how to support children to develop positive attitudes, challenging some of the pervasive negative attitudes around maths in society. We should train and support teachers to put maths in real-life contexts, to support problem-solving skills, and to encourage children to see the value of maths and see the value of why they are learning it, for example, by linking maths to other areas of the curriculum. And we should equip teachers with an understanding of the importance of parents and carers in supporting their children's positive attitudes towards maths, as well as how teachers can engage with parents and carers to do this, for example, through the resources that they use. So I'm going to stop there. Those are some of the ways at National Numeracy we have developed and learnt to support teachers. Many of those actually are covered in the fantastic guide that you have, developed by Sue Skirm and Tom Hunt on your chairs. Some of those are reflected in there and really have informed the way that we've learnt as an organisation at National Numeracy. And we think that, working together, this can help address some of those cyclical, deep societal challenges around maths anxiety, low number confidence, and the prevailing attitudes towards maths. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Shirley, and thank you, Margaret, very much for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a subject that I care about very much. I'm not an expert on mathematics anxiety at all, so I'm going to speak personally and anecdotally. I hope that's okay. Right, I wanted to begin by a warning really about deficit discourses about teachers, and I still see a lot of papers, academic papers, which seem to be about teachers lacking things, teachers lacking mathematics knowledge, or perhaps in this case, teachers lacking the right feelings or the right attitudes. And I think that's something we need to be really careful of, because all of us can identify to some extent with having things that we fear. So I don't personally have maths anxiety, but there are things that we fear, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about that, because those of us who work with children in any capacity, whether it's as teachers or perhaps even just as parents, if we know that there's something we have that we fear, we really don't want to pass that on to children. And we want to sort of break that cycle so that children don't have the fears that perhaps we do. And a fear that I have is water. I'm not good around deep water. And so I thought about this in relation to my daughter when she was very young. I thought, how can I not pass on a fear of water when I'm doing things or going out with her? And so I thought, well, I don't want to avoid water. And so I'll just try and be sort of relaxed around water. So I would say, what do you want to do? Should we go for a walk? And she'd say, let's go for a walk by the canal. And I would think, oh, why do people always want to walk by water? Why the canal? Why can't we go walk somewhere else? Lots of other nice places. But I try and put that to one side, and I'd think, okay, yeah, let's go to the canal. And I would think, okay, relax, breathe slowly, unclench fists, and just say nice things. And isn't it nice how the sun is reflecting on the water? And isn't it a lovely day? And my daughter would say, what's the matter, Daddy? And I would say, what do you mean? There's nothing wrong. Everything's fine. We're just having a nice time, aren't we? You seem sad. And this is when she's very, very little. And I suppose I thought, well, what is she learning about what to do with fear? What is this saying? This is saying, if you fear something, hide it. Don't admit it. Conceal it. Bury it. And that doesn't seem helpful. So if someone is maths anxious, should they try to hide it? We'd probably say no, wouldn't we? If we were working with a young person, we'd say, no, don't hide it. Talk about it. Let's try and help. Don't be ashamed of it. That would be terrible. And yet, when we're talking about teachers, what are we thinking? We're thinking not in front of the children. All right. So if you have maths anxiety, don't talk about that. Don't share that. I wonder if that's the right thing. I wonder if that's the right thing to do. I was thinking about this recently. There's this lovely book. If you haven't seen it, it's an excellent book, I think, by Alf Coles, Natalie Sinclair. I Can't Do Maths. And I got a copy of this book. And I just noticed that at home, I put it face down in the study. And I just thought, I don't really want my daughter to see that title. And isn't that silly? What's that title going to do? It just made me think, is there this sort of conspiracy of silence, that we don't talk about maths anxiety, we don't want teachers to say anything negative about maths, and maybe that's a sort of a denial, stigma, shame. That's unhealthy for teachers, but I think it's unhealthy for children as well, and unrealistic. I think children, perhaps even more than adults, they see, don't they? They see what's going on. They read people. And so I've been thinking, what do we want children to learn? Do we want them to learn there's no such thing as maths anxiety, that nobody's maths anxious, none of the adults that you trust, none of the people that you see at school could possibly be maths anxious? Is that what we want? Or maybe we want them to learn some people are maths anxious, including some teachers, and there's things we can do to help, and you don't need to be. And I suppose that's sort of what I wanted my daughter to learn about water, that some people do have fears about water. You don't need to. And she has grown up very happy swimming, and I take her to swimming lessons every week, and I sit on the side. And when she was very little, she would think it was funny that I could possibly be anxious about water, because that's silly, Daddy, and she would laugh. And then she gets older, we say, well, actually, we don't laugh at people who fear things. We try to understand. And maybe that's the sort of thing that we could be thinking here. So rather than this sort of macho idea that you must conquer all your weaknesses before you're fit to be with children, you mustn't have any weaknesses, you need to address all of that. The best teacher is someone that's absolutely fearless person who has no kind of anxiety about anything. Maybe that's the wrong way to think. Maybe actually a maths anxious teacher could be a great resource. Maybe you don't want all the teachers in your department at school to be maths anxious, but if one or two might be, maybe they have an insight into students that others of us who are not maths anxious don't. Maybe the maths anxious child will see that as somebody that might understand how they feel, that they could talk to, and that could support them in a way that maybe others of us who don't have maths anxiety might not be quite so well placed to do. So I'm not saying we're all teachers need to be maths anxious to be good teachers, but I just think that whatever we bring as teachers, all our strengths and our weaknesses as well, are things that we can use, aren't they? Things that we can try and understand better, work on, of course, but also they give us insights and make us potentially better at our job. So I have this personal conjecture, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I've talked to people who tell me that they have maths anxiety, and when they talk to me and tell me about where they think it came from or how it started, they very often talk about a situation at school where they may be embarrassed by a teacher, they were made to do timed tests that they weren't comfortable with, they had a bad experience. But I've not yet come across anyone who said to me, do you know, I think it all started because I had a teacher who was maths anxious and I just kind of absorbed it from them. I've never had anybody say that. I'm not saying that that can't happen, but my conjecture is just that the maths anxious teacher is perhaps far less likely to be generating maths anxiety in children than the sort of overconfident maths show-off kind of teacher, the one who uses maths almost as a weapon to make other people look small. Maybe that's the kind of teacher that we ought to perhaps be concerned about, where somebody is perhaps using maths in a way that it's showing off, making them look good, but actually creating all kinds of anxieties in kids. And maybe the maths anxious teacher shouldn't be perhaps so worried that they're damaging kids, because people become teachers because they care about kids, because they want to make a positive impact on children. And so to say to a teacher, maybe something about you that's really hard to change could be hurting the kids that you work with, is almost like the worst thing you could imagine saying to a teacher. And I just think that perhaps there's a different way to think about that, where we can see that as something someone brings that is potentially valuable. So that was my thought.
Right, well, thanks very much for inviting me to talk. And what I want to talk about is spatial maths and early years teachers. So I'm just going to start off. We did an informal survey of 16 primary PGCE programs a couple of years ago. And we found that on the whole they did 24 hours of maths. I don't know if you think 24 hours is enough for maths education. But the alarming thing was they only did 2.5 hours on average of geometry. That's not a square pie chart, by the way, that's just a tangram there. And that alarmed us because we have been looking at the importance of spatial reasoning recently, and there is overwhelming research about the links between being good at spatial thinking, this sort of thing, like which of these will fold up into a square-based pyramid. Well, I know the one on the bottom right will, but I have to think about the other ones. I don't know about you. But people who can visualize spatially, on the whole, are good at maths. This is a very, very strong link, and we should be working more on teaching children spatial thinking, it seems. And what I find interesting is people who are good at spatial thinking, this is some American research, tend to go into engineering and maths and computing, also visual arts and performing arts. And people who are not good at spatial thinking tend to go into education and law. Make of that what you will. But what that means is that actually we're missing a trick in not using spatial thinking as a way into maths, and that may be an underutilised route to improving maths achievement. But I think it is also a way into maths for teachers, because spatial maths is much less threatening than numerical maths and is more engaging. And I found this was an interesting comment, that there is no doubt early childhood teachers should be particularly strong in geometry, as well as having a strong interest generally in maths education, because of that strong link between spatial maths and early spatial experiences and mathematics later on. Now, preschool maths is really important, and this is what I want to come on to, is it seems that this is where we can make the greatest difference to children's lives. That actually what children know at the start of school predicts where they'll be later on. If they have a strong foundation at the start of school, they will tend to progress well. If they have a weak foundation, they will tend to make slow progress. And maths achievement is found by some research to be the strongest predictor, more than anything else, of children's overall school achievement. And therefore, the ages of 3 to 5 are when you can make the greatest difference to the most disadvantaged children. And what that means is there's this idea that those who start behind stay behind, and the gap tends to widen in primary school, unless I'm sure you go to certain schools, and we hope more of them. But what that means is that early years practitioners, early years educators are the people who have the greatest power to make the greatest difference to children's life chances. And they are the people who hate and fear maths most. And on the whole, they lack confidence in maths. And every nursery head teacher I talk to says, my staff are not confident in maths. Like all of my staff are not confident in maths, and most of them. And what we know from the Scum and Hunt paper is that maths-anxious student teachers choose the early years. Lots of people are early years educators because they hate maths. And yet, they are the people in this extremely powerful position. And on the whole, they feel like that because their school maths, their secondary maths, made them feel a failure. And I was struck by a story from the Preschool Playgroups Association. And the executive there, they were talking about the training they did with playgroup leaders. And they did some training that had language and literacy, and then they moved on to maths. And he said, you'd have this really enthusiastic group of play leaders, really insightful and creative and enthusiastic. And then they'd come to do the maths part. And they would come in and they would go to the back of the room, slouch down in their chairs, put out their lower lips and say, why do we have to do this? And it was like those bright, intelligent, grown-up women had regressed to surly teenagers. But that's their maths identity that they had, was, why do we have to do this? And that's because that's how their secondary maths had made them feel. And I remember one nursery head saying to me that she had actually moved a lot during her primary education and actually got a lot of gaps. And she had a secondary maths teacher who, when she got the answer wrong, would say, come out to the front and explain that on the board. And you think, well, that's useless because you know I can't do it. And then he would say, well, I can't understand why you don't know this. And I think that goes back to, the secondary teachers who can't explain. And she said her peers weren't, felt sorry for her. They weren't giving her a hard time. But she felt humiliated. And I so often hear these stories of public humiliation from people from their secondary maths education. And they leave school feeling, in terms of maths, a failure. And that then cues how they approach maths when it comes to professional development. So the National Day Nurseries Association have a Maths Champions programme. And this was evaluated by the Education Endowment Foundation a couple of years back. And they found there were two barriers to the effectiveness of that professional development programme. One was time, and the other was that they gave people a maths test at the beginning of the course. And it just destroyed their confidence. It just cued them into thinking, oh, no, I'm rubbish about this. Maths professional development doesn't need to be like that. And I think most people, when they do engage with maths professional development, they're so relieved at how nice it is, they actually become converted. And I was talking to one early years leader who'd been following a maths course we'd been doing, and I said, has this had an effect on the children? And she said, yes, the children have learnt more because the staff have done more maths because they like the practical activities. And so actually just the staff enjoying the activities meant they did more maths and the children learnt more maths. So what are the solutions? Humane maths teaching in schools. I think, really, why are we letting teenagers come out of secondary school feeling a failure? Why are we not enhancing their self-esteem and making them feel positive? And I think professional development that builds on educators' strengths and interests and practical activities and rhymes and stories and their interest in how young children think and learn. Professional development does make a difference, and it is very interesting that we've had very little of it available in the preschool years. Masses on phonics and literacy and social well-being. And I think it's because the people in charge of early years are not terribly keen on having maths innovations. I just wanted to share with you a very interesting bit of professional development, which is a collaboration between mathematicians at the University of Durham, and I mean mathematicians, people who do pure maths, and a local nursery. And they've met twice a term and discuss the sort of things the children are doing and how that might link to maths. And they've actually got 3- and 4-year-olds talking about the acute angles in ramps and things like that. And they had a topic of pattern. And the academics suggested that they might look at symmetry, at spirals, at fractals, yes, fractals. Right? And the staff had to go off and Google fractals. And the staff and the children ended up exploring concentric circles through wood slices. And very interesting questions like, how many circles do you need to have concentric circles? Can you have 1? Or is 2 enough? Concentric circles get bigger. Can they get smaller as well? So they've got these lovely discussions going on. The leader of the nursery said, what she put it down to was the staff suddenly had a buzz about maths, which we knew was to do with the maths academics sharing their passion and love of maths. And from that, I take it's not what the maths that you learn, it's not the maths that you learn, it's not what maths you learn, it's how maths makes you feel that makes the difference. So I just want to leave you with a little plug for the Early Childhood Maths group, which I work with, and we have got a spatial reasoning toolkit, which has got lots of ideas for developing spatial reasoning, which we have found to be popular with practitioners and with children. So I will stop there.
I'm going to introduce our 2 new panel members, Sue Johnson-Wilder, who is, again, an ex-colleague of mine, which is very nice, who is Associate Professor in Maths Education at the University of Warwick, specialising in maths education and, in particular, in inclusion and empowerment in maths through use of technology, history of maths, apparatus, modelling interesting applications, addressing maths anxiety, and developing mathematical resilience. Sue works with teachers, learners, parents and supporters of maths learning. Her current projects include teaching for mathematical resilience in FE and coaching for mathematical resilience in FE. I'll introduce Zebedee as well, and then I'll ask them both to say something. Zebedee, I'm particularly grateful to because she has also stepped in to replace Faye, who was due to come, but again, I'm afraid is ill. So Zebedee Friedman has been teaching maths in secondary schools since 1992 in England and Wales. She's also always had an interest in the relational nature of maths, and this has been an important thread that's run throughout her career. In 2003, she began working with teachers across the southeast, first as an advanced skills teacher, then as a numeracy consultant. She's always maintained her teaching role and was able to keep one foot firmly rooted in the classroom alongside teacher development. She currently teaches full-time in the south of England and also is studying for a professional doctorate in education, where her particular interest is in maths anxiety. So, well done. Sue, would you like to just pick up the...
What really struck me is that the teachers aren't feeling trained to teach maths, but they're certainly not trained to be aware of, to recognise and to address maths anxiety. And that seems to me to be absolutely core to what we try and achieve tonight, given that a third of their clients have maths anxiety of some kind, certainly in secondary school.
Thank you. Zebedee.
Thank you. It's the first time I've ever spoken into a mic, so ever. Something really struck me when Colin was talking about hiding anxiety, and I was thinking about my own career, and having taught since 1992, that's a fair amount of time, And I'm by no means a finished product as a teacher. I'm still learning, I still make mistakes. I still experiment in my classroom. And I was thinking about when it's safe to learn and when we've done a perfect lesson. And it made me think of Brené Brown. And Brené Brown says, shame loves a perfectionist. It keeps us quiet. And that really struck me when Colin was talking about how the pressure as a teacher to hide our inadequacies, and partly that's systemic in terms of how we're measured and how we're scrutinised. But also, I know, you also talked about the overconfident teacher. I know the colleagues I can speak to when I can't do a maths problem, and I know the ones who just alarm me and make me quite anxious.
Thank you. Right. Any points from the floor? So anybody would like to questions?
I had a question about the number of secondary teachers who were feeling anxious and unconfident and didn't feel they had the skills to explain things properly. And I wondered whether some of that comes from the recruitment problem that we have. So we have so many non-specialists teaching maths that you get, we talk about imposter syndrome in academia, but I know it's certainly in the classroom. When I'm teaching a subject that I don't know very well, that can make me really anxious. And we don't have enough maths teachers. So I just wondered if you had thoughts on that.
Would anybody like to come either from the audience? If you want to say anything from the audience, please do. But would anybody like to say something from the panel about the secondary maths teachers who were short of teaching and so on?
I want to say something. I don't think it is just people who don't necessarily come from a maths background. I have a maths degree, and I swear I don't understand a word of that maths degree. I found it very difficult. I learned maths through teaching. And that's trial and error, and that's being given the space to develop or taking the space to develop as a teacher. So I don't think that is just rooted in perhaps people who are non-specialists. I think it can affect any teachers with any background.
Can I add to that? I think we've had a problem since Henry VIII of asking the pure mathematicians to teach school mathematics. And if you look back at that time, he decided to use the pure mathematicians and not the people like surveyors and navigators who used maths in anger. And we're building on that pretty much ever since. And what I think we need to recruit is people who use maths and stats in their everyday life and give them a 2-year teacher training programme.
Thanks. Yes, to begin with, I just wanted to make a comment, and I really enjoyed what Dr. Foster was saying about the sort of the most confident math teacher can quite often be the one that sometimes starts that anxiety with pupils. And I wonder that whether when we're teaching either a maths teacher or a non-math specialist to deliver maths, whether we're having that conversation with them about it's okay if you're not the best mathematician in the room, it's okay if you take your time when you're explaining something, because I think with the teachers that I work with in my role, some of the best teachers, whether they're the best mathematicians or not, they deliver the maths in the time frame that a pupil talks in. So they'll be delivering something, and part of that calculation might be, okay, well, I need to do 7 times 7. Okay, well, 7 times 7 is 49. And they talk in that way with the pupils, and that's what I think helps pupils to realise that that adult in front of me that I really respect and I is trying to teach me something, is working at this in the same rate that I am. So I really appreciated that comment. I think that's really, really important, that we don't try to prove ourselves as mathematicians in the classroom, and we try to make sure that we are empathising with those pupils. And then I had a question, which I don't know if you'll have the answer to, but I wonder whether it could maybe be followed up at a later time. With the survey results at the beginning of the talk, which I thought was so interesting, you spoke about staff not feeling that they're trained to teach math, and I just wondered if you had any underlying data about where those subjects were from. So is that coming from science teachers or geography teachers, or is it maths teachers? So if you probably don't have the answer now, but it'd be really interesting to know where those gaps are in our teaching groups. Thanks.
Going back to our data, we actually don't know what the teachers, how they would describe themselves. We only know that they were teaching maths for some of the time when in the poll. So it would have been, we thought afterwards it would have been really good, because some of them may be filling their timetable with the odd maths lesson, and some of them may be specialist maths teachers with degrees and so on. From our point of view, we don't know, but I don't know, Sam, do you know anything more about the people in your survey?
Those in our survey, again, we do know, but it's primary, it's all secondary subjects. So that's data I shared was across the board. We do know what subjects when it comes to secondary, but it's in its totality.
I mean, it may be interesting. I remember when I was teaching, training secondary teachers, that the first question I always asked was, what are you most afraid of in going into your first sort of teaching practice? And my view was what they should have been afraid of was controlling the classes, because, you know, so far as I could see, that was number one problem. But nobody ever mentioned that. They all said, I'm terrified they'll ask a question that I don't know the answer to. And they all had maths degrees, you know. So I was really surprised that actually the fear was about not being able to answer maths questions, not about, you know, the problems of class control.
I would like you all just to answer the question that this talk this evening's about. Are we giving our teachers adequate training in the teaching of maths? And I've got a feeling maybe the answer is no, we're not, because we've got all these problems. Some aren't even trained to teach maths at the moment who are teaching. But supposing, given this is about maths anxiety, you're just allowed one thing to say to Nick Gibb, the Minister for Schools, what would you do to make things better in terms of teaching? You either giving our teachers a better training for teach or whatever. I want some, because you've all said different things, wonderful things, whether it's spatial reasoning or more numeracy or more collaboration, all those things are important, but you're just allowed one thing to say to the minister, and he's got to do it. What would it be to make us better in terms of maths anxiety and training our teachers better? I'm putting you on the spot because I want to have a practical outcome for this. Oh, Shirley's got the answer.
I got two words: better communication. Now, I'm a trained journalist, and when you're trying to get something out of somebody, and they don't answer you in the way you want, then you try another way, and if that doesn't work, you try another way. And it seems to me that a person who is really keen on maths and good at communication, if the child asks a question and doesn't understand her answer, then she tries a different answer and another different answer until the child does understand or is spoken to later. But it seems to me that in journalism, the first lesson you're told is think from the other side of the desk. And they mean that, the reader. And it seems to me that we are then taught communication. And nobody starts off being a journalist how to do it. They have to learn. And it seems to me that there is a possibility that could be investigated in how maths teachers particularly are taught to communicate. Because you don't have geography anxiety or history anxiety. It does seem to be maths anxiety, and that's the most important thing they're going to learn at school for later on in life. And there is one other thing I'd like to say, because since 2004, I've been interviewing a lot of girls, mainly in their year 9, and the thing I am bored of hearing with them in a very self-satisfied voice is, the day I leave school is the day I'm going to stop maths. And I growl back at them, the day you leave school is the day you're going to need maths.
I'm struggling to think of one where it would definitely be based on would be confidence for me. Whether we're talking about teachers, teacher training, whether we're talking about pupils, we have to be able, I mean, it's a real shame, isn't it, that we've got, depending on the year, 150, 200,000 young people emerging from school they have to fail their GCSE. So and those, at least those 150 are coming out very much with their confidence at a very low point. The thing I hear most speaking to adults, and it comes back to your comment earlier about pace, is two things. Firstly, I've closed the door and I never want to open it again. And secondly, I could do it, but it was just too fast for me. Everyone moved on before I could. I know I could do it, but eventually I lost that. So whether it's teachers or supporting pupils, we have to, I think, move to a way that allows people to build their confidence in teaching maths, confidence in supporting children, and the children to build their confidence. We know from our research at National Numeracy that when it comes to building maths you'll need in everyday life that everyone needs, confidence is always the strongest precursor to building skills. If you don't have confidence, it's very, very difficult to build skills when it comes to maths. So it would be all around that. I'm not sure I've 100% answered it, but it would be something along those lines.
Thank you. So I think I would love it if teachers were able to work together to plan their lessons, to review their lessons, to observe each other teach, not in a kind of judgmental way, but in a way of refining ideas, refining communication, being able to build that confidence, but also build their expertise and share between them. So I think more PPA time, more group time to refine their maths teaching.
I was going to say something very similar, which is you're giving teachers the opportunity to try something out and research it with somebody else and just see whether it works or not. And then the other thing is just take the speed and the right wrongness out of maths.
I agree with lots of the things people have already said. I was thinking about different ways that you can talk about confidence. There's confidence in being able to do things quickly and accurately, but there's other kinds of confidence as well, isn't there? Confidence that if I spend long enough, I can probably figure this out, or that's a different thing altogether. And I think, I suppose for me, there isn't a quick fix. There isn't a one-size-fits-all. But I think that accepting where you're starting from and what your strengths and advantages are. If you've got a maths degree, that could be a great advantage. If you haven't got a maths degree, there's other advantages that you've got from your experience and your, whatever strengths and things you've worked on. And I think playing to your strengths and not beating yourself up because, I don't fit that particular mould, because teachers are all different. And I think building on what you bring, whether that's like a background of struggling yourself, that's going to be your strength because you bring that to the teaching that you do.
A short moment with Nick Gibb, huh? I think I would start with the term psychological safety. And psychological safety. And I would say this is a matter of psychological safety, Nick. These youngsters who aren't attending FE lessons or are throwing chairs in lessons or whatever they're doing, they are not feeling safe. And I spoke to a lady who was a therapist, and she said, oh no, I'm not a maths person. She put her hands up like this in front of her chest to protect herself. And I said, oh, what happened to you? She said, I've never thought about it like that. So if you're maths anxious, it's not that you go around saying you're not a maths person. The question is, what happened to you? What is it that happened to you that made you feel that you need to put your hands up and protect yourself by not going into maths lessons, by saying I'm not a maths person, by excluding yourself from this really important subject domain? So I would go for psychological safety, and I would also say that if I was given any longer with him, you realise the amygdala doesn't like social threats like being left behind, like being humiliated any more than it likes physical threats, and it remembers those.
The advantage of going last is I'm going to take all of that, okay? And I'm going to say something that's close to my heart, and I've rarely been in schools where I've been allowed to teach like this, and I would say, I don't know how strongly to say this, I would make it illegal to set by attainment.
I think in some ways this question has been answered, but perhaps implicitly. What makes a good mathematician? I think that if the answer to that is the right-wrong speed, I think that generates a lot of anxiety. And would it help to define for teachers what we think maths is really about?
We haven't defined what we think the purpose of education is. So I think there's a conversation that needs to happen, which is about the whole nature of what are we trying to do when we're in school. Is it about childminding, or is it about education? If it's about the fullest education, if it's about flourishing, then it's not just about academic attainment. It's not just about a race for grades. It's about what does school prepare you for in life. But we haven't agreed that. There'll be very different views across the road at the moment at DFE to the ones that I'm talking about that fulfilment. So I think it's part of a bigger conversation. That would be my view.
I was looking at the national curriculum recently, and they've got 3 aims, and it's fluency, problem solving, and the middle one actually says reasoning following a line of inquiry. And I think, I don't see a lot of that going on. And yet that is the essence of maths, isn't it? So I think we need to have a bit more of a focus on maths as a discipline. How is it we get to know the things that we think are mathematical knowledge? And engage children in that following a line of inquiry.
I think a mathematician, on top of all those other things, is somebody who knows how to manage their feelings when they fail or when they struggle. And that's the part that we are not teaching in schools. And if the teachers we're talking about who are anxious understood that's part of their job when they're stuck, to model how to behave when you're stuck, that would be a big step forward.
You might recognise this: openness, questioning, inventiveness, persistence, emotional stability, generosity and empathy. And I think they were the dispositions that Alison spoke about. I thought they were wonderful.
I wonder if some anxiety comes from unrealistic expectations of what it means to be good at maths, and if actually so many of the people who are quite well qualified and do maths for a living in the sense of teaching it to other people feel they're not very good. I have a friend who has a PhD in maths and who says he's not very good at maths. And there's this kind of feeling like people go on in maths until the point where they find it really difficult and then they stop quite often, and that might be at a very high level, and often ends their progress through maths with failure in their eyes. And so I think there's a lot of people thinking they're not very good at maths, but actually they're very good by lots of standards. And I think that contributes to, I think people teaching think they ought to be able to do lightning calculations and never make any mistakes. And why do we think that that's normal? Why do we think that other people can do that?
I just wanted to say that with another hat on, I'm involved with a thing called Maths World UK, which has a maths city in Leeds, which is a converted restaurant. Has lots of fun maths in there. We reckon that every child needs to be able to succeed at every task, and they do in general. They come in either groups from schools or with parents and so on. And it's just great fun. It's hands-on, so you can always, manage to do the task you're on somehow or other. But the sad thing to me is that some of the teachers will say, this is wonderful, it's great fun, this is what maths is really about, which I think is to answer your question. But it's such a pity we don't have time to do it in schools, because the pressure of covering the syllabus, the timetable, etc., and the testing and so on is just too great. So that's, I would love to get rid of all that in order to make more space for real maths.
Well, Margaret, speaking from the audience, I think we had a very interested audience. They were thinking as one this evening. Everybody was interested in the subject. They all had their 2 cents worth to put in. And I think they all enjoyed it. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think I think it's a very committed audience, and everybody has, their own reason for being here.
A lot more women than men.
I didn't notice that. But I think it was the atmosphere. I think people are very keen to carry on, and it was really good to all be together.
I think we all know there is a worry.
Yeah.
We all know this is a problem. Why doesn't the government know that this is a problem?
Yeah, I think people were actually didn't quite come to the fact that the government could do something about this. Perhaps people are scared of saying so. I kind of felt that there were lots of really good ideas floated. But actually, why isn't somebody taking urgent action? I think we could have attacked that a little bit more. This is an important problem, and it's not going to go away easily unless something radical happens.
Well, I did notice, I've been studying maths since 2004, so that's an awful long time if I add it up on my fingers. And I had great difficulty in interesting anybody at all about maths anxiety to begin with. But especially journalists, because journalists I could not get to talk to me about maths. Makeup, yes. Holidays, yes. How to do your housework faster, yes. But maths, no. But since the epidemic, since coronavirus, when so many parents have been involved in home learning, I have noticed that since then the atmosphere has changed considerably. I think it's called vibe movement.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about that, but
they're much more open.
Yes.
They're much more open-minded to why the problem exists and what they can do about it.
But I think you should take credit for some of that, Shirley, because, when you started this, nobody acknowledged it. And now there are lots of people, it's not lots of people who are doing PhDs in it, there are departments of maths anxiety, so it really
we
is...
invented the problem. No, we named it.
Yes, but I think actually getting it out there and making people think about it and making them reflect on their own experiences of themselves and other people has really brought it to a...
You said their own
light.
Experiences. I think that mothers and fathers, once they've had to understand the maths textbooks, they can see how rotten they are. They can see that the child couldn't possibly learn because they can't understand them.
I've had a completely riveting but somewhat alarming evening at the Maths Anxiety Trust conference, because I've learnt that there's a massive problem about the teaching of maths at school, and maths is absolutely central to people's understanding of the world and everything else. And that problem isn't being addressed by the big people, the people in government and higher education policy setting. If one were to summarize the one figure that represents this, it's the fact that, I'm quoting here, 44% of secondary maths teachers believe that they haven't been sufficiently trained to teach maths. And this discussion of it by a lot of very clever people in turn provoked a lot of people in the audience, people who are 10 times better educated than me, people who have things like PhDs in pure maths, to say that they spent a lot of their education time in a state of terror or confusion. Well, I think we should be told, and I think it's marvellous that we are being told, that we are hearing about the underlying realities of a vastly important part of our educational process. And it's the part that most people reckon is the key to our performance in the world, our competitive performance in the world, our performance in manufacturing and trade and so on. So if we can't address this, if education ministers can't address this, what are they doing?
So what did you think of that, Shirley? The event went well?
I was very happy to get these beautiful flowers, but I think the event went very well because we've had quite a lot of events, and this was, I think, the one where the audience was working as a whole. They were all interested in what we were doing. They all had their little bits to contribute. And those little bits added up to a lot of interest, I think, and a lot of nailing what was wrong with the present math system. And there is something wrong with the present math system. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had these dreadful results from our poll. And we have known, the government has known, but done nothing that I can see about it that's positive, for at least 20 years, that 1 in 4 children leaves school unable to do maths. 25%.
I think we had some really good speakers who brought different views and different aspects to it all. Lots of ideas there, but I think we need to think about perhaps having another session to nail some of these, put some of these ideas together and try and find a way forward, because it's certainly been a very fascinating evening.
Perhaps we might try having, say, 6 areas, which would result in 4 people turning up, but with their views on what to do about a certain sector of the problem. But you see, there is only maths anxiety in Britain. There's not history anxiety or geography anxiety. We've got to find out where it starts and stop the circle.